The main room of the magic tower became the place of judgment today, where in the center of the room, a girl stood before 13 magicians. The only man with an uncovered head said that the Council of Magicians had made its decision, and Selena would be exiled. The girl standing in the center of the room was quite surprised by this decision of the Council of Magicians. While the High Mage continued to talk about how the girl's research had become too dangerous and was frightening many, thus explaining the reasons for the decision taken, Selena herself thought about how she was being exiled by the one she had picked up from the street, whom she had taught magic, who had achieved such a position only thanks to her. The girl's face changed as she thought about expulsion, and only one thought came to her mind. This guy didn't know gratitude. Meanwhile, the Supreme Mage declared that if she calmly accepted their decision, they would not kill her, but would only deprive her of her magical abilities, giving her the opportunity to live out her days as an ordinary person. The girl silently listened to everything the Supreme Mage said, and when he finished, Selena sharply told Malik that either he was out of his mind, suggesting such a thing, or there was something wrong with the girl's perception, since she heard such a proposal, which she could not call anything other than complete nonsense. Saying that it was she who founded the Kingdom of Magicians, Selena kicked the stone floor with all her might, using magical power. The shockwave created by the girl knocked down some of the magicians surrounding Malik, but he, calling everyone to calm, said that this was Selena's last chance. At that very moment, the girl began to be entangled in chains controlled by the magical powers of Malik and the other 12 magicians. And in a matter of seconds, the girl stood bound in chains that had a special spell placed on them. Selena tried to break the chains with all her strength, but was unable to do so. Continuing to look at the girl's useless efforts, Malik said that he was using her own spell in these chains, only modified, and once again noted that her activities had become dangerous, and the girl's very existence in this world now brought danger to people. Selena, realizing what the man was getting at, looked in surprise at her judge, with whom they had previously had a lot in common. Her hand fiddled with the robe she was wearing, revealing that she was nervous, even though she was trying to appear calm. Meanwhile, all the magicians began to wield their magic wands, and Malik told the girl to get ready. Selena's gaze completely conveyed what was going on inside the girl, where her past with Malik flashed before her eyes, where with him she finally found a family. They studied magic together, were both friends and colleagues, and experienced life and death together. And this man was for her the only and most valuable thing that could be obtained in this life. Now, instead of that dear and beloved person, the girl was faced with her judge and executioner all rolled into one. While all these thoughts were running through Celine's head, the magicians carrying out the sentence were reading spells, and a magic circle appeared under the girl, where, with complete hopelessness in her gaze, Selena noted that they were preparing to use the magic of complete disappearance on her, which would allow them to erase all traces of her existence. At the same time, her power is suppressed with the help of spells she created, preparing to destroy her body, soul, mana. Looking up at her executioner, the girl asked him how he had even decided and was capable of such a thing. But her answer was silence. Malik did not say a word. Selena lowered her head and sadly concluded that no one would even try to save her in this situation. And the spell began to work, and the girl's body gradually dissolved into thin air. The girl gathered all the strength she had left, concentrated carefully, and tried to break free. But having anticipated such actions, the Supreme Mage strengthened the effect of his spell, restraining Selena's powers. In a fit of rage, the girl screamed that she cursed and hated the Supreme Mage Malik, and she added that if she suddenly somehow returned to Earth, was reborn, or became undead, then she would finish him off first. Watching Selena's body gradually dissolve into thin air, Malik said that she would no longer be able to do anything without the ability to use her magic, and that she would finally feel like an ordinary person whom she once looked down on. After what was said, the man suddenly thought that Selena did not try to use black magic, which meant that control over these abilities of hers was also with the help of his spell. Selena suddenly noted with horror that she, the head of the Kingdom of Magicians, the greatest sorceress, was dying here. Just like that, dissolving completely into thin air. A satisfied smile and an arrogant look accompanied Malik's last word, which Selena heard, and which was the word goodbye. The girl could no longer say anything, because the lower part of her face had already dissolved into thin air, and so she only thought about how he dared to say goodbye to her like that, as if she were nothing to him. And with the last dissolved particles of Selena's body, her last thought addressed to Malik also flew into the air, which was expressed in just one word: creature. After wandering in pitch darkness, Selena suddenly saw a bright light, rejoicing that she would finally be able to go to heaven or hell. But suddenly, a chandelier appeared before her eyes, provoking the girl to ask a reasonable question about where in the afterlife a chandelier could have come from, and why everything here was so high up. Deciding to look around, she suddenly saw a small hand that clearly belonged to a child. And when she tried to pronounce a word, Selena heard the inarticulate sounds of a child who had not yet learned to speak coming out of her mouth. The girl discovered with horror that she was not in the afterlife, but in the body of some baby. The maid suddenly appeared and expressed displeasure at the child for being very noisy, and with a quick movement of the hand, the girl's mouth was shut with a pacifier, after which the maid returned to her daily duties. Finally convinced that this was not a dream or the afterlife, Selena tried to move and discovered that her body was not obeying her at all. But after several unsuccessful attempts, she finally managed to get into a sitting position. The girl noted with bitterness that she had hoped to live a normal life in hell after death. But instead, she received this small, weak body of a baby. Deciding to calm down and think things through, Selena looked around the room carefully, finding it quite empty. Every now and then a maid passed by, first in one direction, then in the other, talking either to herself or to the child who didn't understand anything. From the accent and the specificity of the spoken language, Selena concluded with horror that she was most likely in the Korean Empire, where one very unpleasant acquaintance of hers from a past life came from. But then, having collected her thoughts, the girl noted that the main thing was that she was alive again. The main thing was not to sit in this crib for years, waiting for her to grow up, and it was also necessary to understand whether her magical abilities were preserved. The object for training was a vase of flowers standing near the crib. The girl lay down, spreading her arms out to the sides, and concentrated, trying to summon her mana and use magical powers, which she managed to do quite quickly, where she moved the vase, causing it to break with a loud clang. Selena felt a real sense of relief when she realized that her magical powers had not abandoned her and she could cast spells. Meanwhile, the maid was lamenting the fact that a vase had broken for no apparent reason, the cost of which would now definitely be deducted from her salary. Selena already had a plan for further action prepared, where, trying to get back on her feet, she decided to first escape, then gain strength, strengthening her magical abilities, and of course, return to the tower for revenge on Malik. However, to her disappointment, the girl discovered that she was completely unable to get back on her feet. There was nothing left to do but resort to magic again, which she did immediately. With concentration, Selena was able to lift the small body into the air, and after a few seconds she moved from her little crib to the floor. She hadn't even managed to crawl a couple of meters when she was discovered by a vigilant maid, who immediately returned her to her crib, accompanying her movements with words of bewilderment as to how the child had managed to get out of bed. Suddenly, Selena felt very tired. Her eyelids became unbearably heavy and she instantly fell asleep. Warm rays of the bright summer sun burst into the room where Selena had been living in her new body for a month. Lying in her bed, the girl tried to systematize in her thoughts what she had learned over the past time. One of the observations was that her maids change about once a week, and most of the time she is of no use to anyone. The maids have enough to do, so they just run in to feed the child and leave her completely alone for a few hours. Another observation was that one should be careful with a pacifier, since its presence in the mouth works better than any sleeping pill, instantly putting one to sleep. And finally, some observations allow the girl to make the assumption that she is with the Crown Duke of Horan. There were many legends about this empire, including the legend that one day, a beautiful person with silver hair descended from paradise, fell in love with a man, and they had children with silver eyes that do not exist in the human world, which their descendants inherited. Subsequently, one of the silver-eyed ones made a great contribution to the development of the empire, for which their family was honored by the emperor, where their family became noble. It only remained to understand what kind of body Selena got, where, according to her assumptions, this child was somehow related to the duke's family, not being a commoner, but at the same time, the birth of this child was not desired. Using her magical powers again, Selena moved from her small bed onto the floor. And then the thought occurred to her that she could very well be the child of the inadequate, in her opinion, tyrant Edward. And with these thoughts, the girl crawled forward. Finding herself at the door soon, she used magic again to open the door. And at that moment, she realized that she could only use magic while lying down and using her entire small body, which in itself made it difficult to escape from this place. There was no exit immediately behind the door. Instead, Selena saw a large, long corridor. Without thinking twice, the girl began to overcome what was, for this body, a considerable distance. Stopping, she suddenly decided that she should first just explore the castle, where she was so delighted with her brilliant idea that she dropped her pacifier and decided to wash it somewhere first. She walked down another corridor in search of a place where she could wash her pacifier, which was dirty from the fall. Beyond this corridor there was another one. And finally, tired Selena sat down on the floor, concluding that this mansion was simply huge, and she would have to explore it forever. At that moment, her attention was drawn to the sound of pouring water, where, turning her head, the girl in the girl's body saw a huge fountain. Quite quickly she crawled out into the street, and the fountain was truly enormous for the small body that the girl had. For a second, Selena thought that maybe she should go back. But then, remembering what she had to endure on the way here, she dismissed the thought. At the same time, the Duke walked past, accompanied by his butler. They caught the child just as she was trying to reach for the water to wash her pacifier. With a hint of hostility in his voice, the Duke asked the butler Parsons what it was, pointing towards the fountain. Parsons replied with complete calm that it was clearly a child who was the daughter of the late Mr. William. The Duke could not believe what he heard, as he believed that his late son's child must still be a baby. And of course, he was quite surprised at what she was doing there. Suddenly, the Duke heard Edward's voice approaching and asking what his father was doing now. The Duke pointed to the child by the fountain, answering his son's question that she was his late brother's daughter. William attributed his niece's unusual behavior to her lineage, noting that his late brother had fathered a child with a woman of lower social standing. Unaware that she had already become the object of attention of the 3 inhabitants of this mansion, Selena continued to try in vain to reach the water to wash her pacifier. Meanwhile, Edward, declaring that the presence of this creature here meant that the maids had failed in their work, was preparing to use his magical abilities, and beams of magical energy had already begun to surround him. But the Duke, who intervened in the development of events, told the man to keep his strength under control. This statement by his father provoked a response from Edward, who stated that the Duke had softened over time, to which the Duke noted with regret that his son had begun to be rude to him more often, which was not very good. Probably realizing that his father was right, Edward did not contradict him and simply listened to his reproach in silence. And all this time, Selena was trying to reach the treasured water, which should help her put her nipple in order. At some point, in despair, burning with rage at finding herself in such a helpless state, she decided that she simply needed to use her magical abilities. She tried to focus on using her abilities, but suddenly remembered that she couldn't do it while standing. And at that moment, when she decided to lie down to use magical power, Selena saw 3 men standing nearby. Among them, she immediately recognized Duke Dorian and his son, Edward Bennet, whose faces had not changed much, which indicated that not much time had passed since her death. Only now did she fully imagine what could happen if she used her magical abilities in front of them. She stared at the face of Edward Bennet, who was smart, successful, and a master of magic. Selena remembered well how she met him at the age of 16, just as she remembered well how he ignored everyone below his level, associating only with aristocrats. As for Dorian Bennet, it was even more difficult to have any dealings with him. The girl recalled the countless number of times she had approached the Duke with various requests and received numerous refusals. All this brought back sad memories of a past life, where she desperately defended her dear country, but was betrayed by those closest to her and was executed. But suddenly leaving these sad thoughts about the past behind, Selena decided with great joy that this time everything would be different. She would win if she could catch everyone off guard. Meanwhile, Edward expressed a complaint to the maid about the part where, after the remarks she had already made, she was still in no hurry to take the child back to the room, after which the maid literally jumped up to fulfill her master's demand. Not wanting to be caught and not wanting to go back to the room, And also realizing that the pacifier was still dirty, Selena tried to crawl away from the maid. Watching a maid unsuccessfully try to catch a little girl running away from her on all fours, Edward compared the girl to a cockroach, much to his father's confusion, perhaps thinking about what had been missed in his son's upbringing. Duke Bennett turned away, his sad thoughts clearly reflected in his facial expressions. Meanwhile, Edward continued to taunt, declaring that the mere thought that this crawling creature had inherited some of the Bennett blood horrified him, and that this half-breed should never bear their name. Dorian glanced at the game of tag his granddaughter was playing with the maid, after which, turning his head, he said that, without his son's reminders, he perfectly remembers the origin of this child and imagines her future. And finally, the maid managed to catch the child, who was resourceful beyond his years, where she did not hesitate to tell the girl that because of her she received a scolding from Mr. Edward, which Selena was not at all interested in, since she was thinking about the fact that she was able to be caught, even though she was moving at maximum speed. A few days later, bright and warm rays of the sun once again burst into the room, where the little girl, in whose body Selena found herself, lived. The girl in the girl's body lay in her crib and thought that she, the powerful magician Selena, could now truly be considered dead, since some servant had managed to catch her. Well, the maid, in turn, was very surprised that the child had been behaving very quietly for the last few days, which Selena had spent rethinking her life. However, this new life, especially with the preservation of magical abilities, could not help but please, and was certainly better than the afterlife. The maid stated that the child had nothing to be happy about because she was a half-breed and would never live the life of an aristocrat, something she certainly couldn't understand at this point due to her age. But at the same time, the maid asked the child to behave the same way as she had for the entire past week. The words that a whole week had already passed made Selena furious, because she hadn't even noticed that a week had passed. After thinking about it, she came to the conclusion that this dirty pacifier was to blame for everything, while also thinking that, in principle, if mana circulated through the body, it would cleanse itself of dirt. After all, it is precisely because of this that magicians do not get sick, although there have been cases when magicians died from the incorrect use of mana. After these thoughts, the girl came to the conclusion that she should be more careful with mana in this body, because a small and untrained body might not be able to withstand the accumulation of a large amount of mana. To maintain normal concentration and control of her mana, she decided through her tears to continue sucking on the pacifier, which she again decided to try to wash. This time, the long corridors of the mansion did not seem as long to her as before, and after a short period of time, Selena was already crawling along one of the paths outside the mansion. Finding herself on the grass, she suddenly noticed that it was much more comfortable to crawl here than along the stone corridors of the mansion. And thinking again about her situation, Selena noted that there is no greater humiliation in the world for an aristocrat than to be born a bastard, and even into the Bennett family. But the girl immediately reassured herself that she still had everything ahead of her, and she would grow up to be a very powerful sorceress, where not only the Bennett family, but the entire empire will fall. With these positive thoughts, she continued on her way, also noting that she had not met anyone either on the way here or in the garden itself, and that she could visit here more often. And finally, Selena saw what she had been looking for so long, in the form of an artificial reservoir. Instantly appearing next to him, she took the pacifier out of her mouth and tried to dip it into the water. But she quickly realized that even here, the size of her small body did not allow her to wash the pacifier, and so she returned it back to her mouth. But a moment later, it dawned on her that if she couldn't wash the pacifier while sitting, then why not try lying down, where, from the unexpected simplicity of the idea, she even dropped the pacifier. Having taken the right position, Selena finally achieved her goal and lowered the pacifier into the pond. Having thoroughly rinsed her treasure, she took it out of the water and began to examine it closely, noting that it was not very clean and had not yet become so soaked. At that moment, the voice of a man who had silently approached from behind asked what was going on here. Selena literally jumped up in surprise, where her precious, almost washed pacifier flew out of her hands and landed at the feet of the uninvited guest. The girl rushed with all her might to the place where her nipple had fallen, where, taking it in her hands, she remembered the ancient rule: according to which if a fallen object lies on the ground for no more than 3 seconds, then it is not considered fallen. And the unexpected guest, who turned out to be a boy of about 5 years old, asked the child what she was doing there. After examining the boy, Selena noted that he looked very much like Edward Bennett, and she had also heard from the maids that he had a son. She also noted that, apparently, the character of this boy, who said that she couldn't be here, was much softer than the character of his father, because Edward Bennett was called a cold-blooded demon, capable of turning against even his allies if necessary. He never dealt with fools, but even if a person was smart, to communicate with Edward he had to come from a noble family. And even if the great sorceress Selena turned out to be a commoner, he would despise her. Turning her thoughts back to the 5-year-old boy, she decided that she would see what would eventually become of this descendant of the Bennett family. Thoughts about age carried Selena away into dreams that when she turns 5, she will be able to master the spells of lower-level circles, which will give her the opportunity to learn how to use more advanced magic techniques, because now she already knows what to do. She will just need to repeat it all. Where, first of all, she will learn to create various magical stones and jewels, which will allow her to support herself. And then she will be able to use magic to escape from this hated house. After thinking about her future prospects, Selena decided to keep the boy and, just in case, wash the pacifier again, since the 3-second rule for some reason did not inspire much confidence in her. Having already gotten the hang of it, she quickly lowered her hand into the water and began to rinse the pacifier. But the boy was not at all embarrassed by the lack of attention from the child towards him, and he came closer, which the girl did not really like. He was apparently worried about the child's fate, because he started saying again that she shouldn't come here, otherwise she would be kicked out. Selena remembered the time when a Bennett family servant had her tendons cut and was thrown out of the house simply because she went into the garden without permission. She even remembered an incident that happened in the city of magicians, where one of the magicians begged her on his knees not to take him with her to the Bennett house when she planned to visit them. As soon as Edward said one word, all the magicians nearby began to shake with fear. Only Selena herself and that creature Malik were not afraid to meet him face to face, communicate, and even argue. With these thoughts in mind, as well as plans for revenge on everyone, she finished washing the pacifier and put it back in her mouth. But the boy couldn't calm down, talking about how his father himself takes care of this garden, doesn't allow anyone to come in here, and will get very angry if he finds out that the girl was here. Selena was very surprised that such a cold-blooded reptile as Edward could take care of the garden on his own. There was silence in the air for a moment, which was interrupted by the boy's words that his mother really liked this garden. Selena, with a very displeased expression on her face, mentally replied that she was not going to listen to his snotty stories. And in general, she was still a baby who couldn't speak. And the boy continued, telling that his parents divorced after his father had a big fight with his mother. Maintaining the same expression on her face, Selena only thought that it was time for the boy to disappear from her sight, which didn't stop him from continuing to talk about how he still loved his mother very much. And after these words, he suddenly sat down, hid his head, and saying that he really missed his mother and wanted to see her, began to cry. The girl's expression softened a little, but she still tried to convince herself that this boy was part of the Bennett family, and therefore he was not worth feeling sorry for at all. Here the boy raised his tear-stained eyes, saying the word, "Mother." Looking at his face, Selena suddenly felt that it was very difficult for her to contain her feelings, and noted the lack of strict upbringing in the spirit of Edward. But having decided that she didn't know how to calm children down, and that she couldn't speak right now either, the girl got ready to leave the place of the unexpected meeting. As she moved through the grass, she thought about how much her knees and palms, calloused from crawling, hurt. But Selena was distracted from thoughts of pain and the fact that this pain would not leave her for a long time by the sound of approaching footsteps. She had no need for new meetings, and she decided not to tempt fate and to wait it out somewhere. The closest place to wait out the danger was, of course, the bushes, where the girl found shelter with a view of the path. The new possible counter turned out to be Edward himself. His appearance struck fear into the girl, who again remembered the servant's tendons and decided that the same fate awaited her if she were caught now. Trying not to make any noise, Selena decided to quickly escape from the impending threat. However, it was not possible to do this silently, and Edward heard movement in the bushes. He looked intently in the direction from which the movement was heard, and he noted that the one who entered his garden was that very child, in whom flows not only the blood of his family, but also the blood of ordinary people. In an instant, a terrible thought came to his mind that perhaps he should kill this child altogether, justifying it by saying that he did not see who was there in the bushes and mistook him for an intruder. But at that very moment, he imagined his father's reaction to such an excuse, where the Duke would definitely not believe it, knowing the mental abilities of his son. From the thought that his father was not a fool, Edward switched to thoughts about the fact that the garden needed to be tidied up. Moving a little further, the man suddenly saw his son Danny sitting on the ground, who immediately stood up at the sight of his father, hiding his tear-stained face and apologizing for entering his garden, giving his son a look that was not typical of a tyrant. Edward said that the boy had done nothing wrong, and could henceforth come to the garden whenever he wanted. When his father asked him if he had been there alone, the boy admitted that a small child had been there just recently. Where did this child wash that thing they put in children's mouths in the pond? Edward wasn't very surprised by what the boy told him. He probably only asked questions to talk to his son. After patting the boy on the head and looking at his face, which showed that he had recently cried, the man concluded that the boy missed his mother. Having no more questions for his son, Edward said that Danny could go if he wanted. But now the boy had questions, where he asked his father whether he would punish this child and throw him out of the house. Without answering the question, the man sent the boy away and reflected on how he didn't remember raising his son to be so gentle, concluding that Danny took after his grandfather. And then his thoughts turned to the baby, where he wondered if it was a coincidence that the child had come all this way just to wash his pacifier. The next day, Selena woke up in her crib as usual. Stretching, she noticed that the pacifier felt much nicer in her mouth after she washed it. Suddenly, the girl realized that no one was coming to feed her. And yesterday, she hadn't eaten anything all day either. She remembered returning from the garden to her room unnoticed, but had no recollection of anyone coming to feed her. Suddenly, the thought occurred to her that they wanted to starve her to death, where perhaps the maid who had gotten into trouble because of her had decided to take revenge this way. Or maybe it was Edward who found out that the child was in his garden and decided to kill the half-breed in this way. Selena sat and carefully went over in her head all the possible options of what was happening and why none of the maids were coming to see her. From time to time, the girl glanced at the door in the hope that one of the maids would come in and feed her. Several hours passed, but no one appeared in the room, which sent Selena into a state of panic. There was no longer any doubt that they had decided to kill her by starving her to death, but the girl decided that they would not succeed. She had gone through such trials in her past life, and could cope with this too. After some thought, she decided that she would first need to visit the garden of that scoundrel Edward, where on the bushes she managed to notice the presence of berries, which in her opinion should be edible. Concentrating, Selena called upon her magical powers to once again leave her crib and go out to find food. But only when she landed on the floor did she feel severe pain in her palms and knees. That is, in those parts of the body that come into contact with surfaces when she crawls. However, there was nothing to be done, food was needed, and, overcoming the pain, before visiting the garden, she went to look for the kitchen to quickly grab something to eat, where along the way she had to hide every now and then from the maids, whose arrival she had so eagerly awaited just recently. Near one of the doors, the girl smelled the aroma of food. Having taken the already familiar position in which magical abilities were available to her, Selena concentrated, and the door opened under the influence of magical powers. As she crawled inside, she wondered what children ate anyway, where before she had only been brought milk. But in principle, considering she had a couple of front teeth, she could eat something harder. The girl's sense of smell did not fail her, because she really found herself in a kitchen that was simply filled with the most exquisite dishes. Seeing the cauldron with liquid and smelling the pleasant aroma, Selena assumed that there was soup there. But then she noted with regret that she didn't know how to eat hot soup yet, and she needed to look for something else. Selena looked around and suddenly her eyes found what she needed. Right next to her stood a wooden box with apples. Having spied on what the cooks were doing, who were currently on break and sitting at the other end of the room, chatting about their own things, the girl decided to take action. She quickly assumed a pose that allowed her to access her magical abilities. And a moment later, 2 apples were already lying on the floor next to the box. But now, a new problem arose where it was necessary to somehow carry away these 2 apples. Selena attempted to stuff the apple under her clothes. However, this undertaking failed completely. as the apple did not fit under her small clothes and soon slipped out of her hands altogether. And suddenly a great idea came to the girl's head, causing her face to light up. She would definitely be able to carry away at least one apple, squeezing it between the two teeth she had. At some point along the way, her tired mouth couldn't take it anymore and Selena dropped the apple on the floor. Then she decided to use magical power to carry the apple, where she needs to concentrate all the mana in her front teeth, and then she will not need to put in much physical effort. Reaching her room, Selena noted with anger that none of the maids had come, and that was how her first day of survival ended. 2 weeks have passed since that day, and no one has entered the room where the small child was. This didn't really upset Selena, who had managed to gather enough food for herself during this time, and regularly replenished her supplies, thinking that an ordinary child in such conditions would have died long ago. After breakfast, she went for a walk, as she thought she needed some fresh air, and it wouldn't hurt to wash the pacifier once again. She happily went into the garden once again, where she could always gather a lot of food. Having reached the fruit-bearing plants, Selena discovered that the stems with berries had been cut off, deciding that this had been done on purpose by Edward. Suddenly, she heard a cry that was already familiar to her, which irritated her when she heard it for the first time, and irritates her no less now. She noted with no pleasure that she had bumped into Edward's son again. Not wanting to meet Selena, she simply decided to crawl past, but Danny noticed the child and came closer, asking what she was doing there. Sitting down on the grass with a not very happy expression on her face, the girl thought about how stupid this boy was, asking questions to a small child who couldn't answer them because he couldn't speak yet. Straining her memory, the girl for some reason tried to remember the name of this boy. But, not remembering, she abandoned this idea and crawled to the pond, where she began to rinse the pacifier, and Danny followed her to the pond. The boy's suggestion to wash the pacifier came as a complete surprise to Selena. She looked into his clear and kind eyes, and saw his open palm waiting for the pacifier to be placed in it. And the girl didn't keep us waiting long, handing over her pacifier to the boy. William attributed his niece's unusual behavior to her lineage, noting that his late brother had once fathered a child with a woman of lower social standing. Having received the pacifier, Danny began to wash it, noting out loud that the pacifier was very dirty and difficult to wash, to which the child, if he could, would have said, but as it was, he only thought that there was nothing surprising, since she probably hadn't been washed for years. But soon the boy handed the child a clean pacifier. Sitting down next to her on the grass, he smiled and said that he was glad to help, while Selena, with the pacifier in her mouth, reasoned that a 5-year-old boy was, of course, stronger than a baby, and it would be easier for him to wash the pacifier. Then the boy started talking again about how the child shouldn't come here so often, but Selena no longer listened to him, heading back to her room, upset that she had not managed to pick berries today. But the boy suddenly stood up and followed her, which completely discouraged her. The girl stopped and turned around to think of how to tell this annoying boy to stay away from her. But at that very moment, a piercing scream rang out above their heads, causing both children to flinch. And right after the sound, the one who made it appeared, a huge griffin. Selena was amazed at how a griffin, which should only live in Mediterranean ruins, could have come here. She knew perfectly well that despite his size, he only hunted small animals and could very well attack a child. So, thinking that they needed to run, she desperately beat her small hand against the boy's leg. Not understanding what was going on, the boy asked the child what had happened. And Selena, deciding that she had already done too much for him, rushed into the bushes at top speed. At that very moment, the Duke appeared in the garden, loudly expressing his indignation at the appearance of a griffin on their estate. And the girl watched Dorian appear, accompanied by servants already hiding behind a tree. Completely stunned by what they saw, the men stood staring at the sky, not believing that a griffin was there. Selena also turned her gaze to the formidable predator. Suddenly, the griffin changed its trajectory and sharply jerked downwards. He chose as his target a little boy who didn't know what to do in such a situation. A familiar voice behind him calling the boy made him turn around joyfully. Without thinking twice, Danny ran up to his father and hugged him. Selena looked with amazement at the love with which Edward treated his son, and caught herself thinking that she had never thought that this tyrant had such a side. Having sent the boy to his grandfather, Edward went out to duel with the griffin, declaring that it was common for worthless people like him to go astray, but he would now show him the right direction. Watching from her safe place, Selena remembered the rumors about Edward's strength, where they said that he could masterfully handle any type of weapon. There was also a rumor that he had found some very powerful artifact in the ruins. Remembering all this, the girl decided that there was nothing to be afraid of, since such a warrior was here, and decided to leave. And at that very moment, Edward made a sharp lunge towards the griffin, clutching a spear in his hand, ready to strike. The distance was too great, and the griffin clearly saw the danger of such a close approach. The blow was delivered, but the beast easily dodged it, rising into the air. Observing everything that was happening, the Duke finally expressed his indignation at what they were doing in the magic tower, since the griffins had broken out of the ruins. The mention of the tower made Selena freeze in place, as she immediately remembered that the tower's mages had the most artifacts. Edward, turning to his father, began to express his assumptions regarding the appearance of the griffin, where, in his opinion, this enraged beast simply lost its owner. Selena listened with sadness to what Edward was saying. After all, by the owner of the terrible beast, he meant precisely her, the one who died. These words deeply affected the girl, and bowing her head, she quietly crawled to her room, where it was easy for her to leave unnoticed, since everyone was busy with the griffin. Selena got to the mansion quite quickly and without adventures or unwanted encounters. As she walked through its long and sometimes gloomy corridors, she wondered why the mages had stopped watching over the ruins. After all, the griffin comes from the ruins that are under the control of the tower, and its presence here means that there are some problems in the tower. The ruins have existed since ancient times, as have the magical beasts that inhabit them. The ruins also contain objects known as artifacts, which are sources of powerful magic. Some artifacts are capable of controlling people, others may defend them, and others may curse. Everyone wants to get their hands on at least one artifact, because its owner becomes much stronger. Selena summed up her thoughts. The problem is to find the artifact, where you need to enter the ruins and go down an endless staircase. On the way to the artifact, the seeker will encounter many magical beasts. For example, the same griffin. Today, only 7 artifacts are known in the world, and there are only 37 ruins, where those who want to increase their power regularly leave their lives. Crawling from step to step, Selena remembered that the tower currently possessed 3 artifacts, 2 of which were dark and 1 light. Light artifacts contain sacred energy, while dark ones contain the opposite evil energy. There are only 2 light artifacts in this empire, one of which is in the Bennett family. Another artifact is located in the Imperial Palace itself. With thoughts of the 2 remaining 7 artifacts being in an empire overseas, of Malik not caring at all about running the tower, and finally of her own despondent mood, Selena made her way to her room. She decided that she needed to sleep, to let the sad thoughts go away. But before that, she needed to eat. She couldn't stop thinking about how Danny met his savior father. And moving towards the food, Selena noted with envy that, in general, it's quite good when there is someone to save you. And now, finally, she got to her food. The girl's mood improved dramatically when the berries were in her hands. Some noise in the street made her look up from her meal for a second. But concluding that they were simply trying to subdue the griffin, Selena returned to her berries. A huge shadow covered her entire small body, completely unexpectedly. As she turned around, the girl heard the words of the men on the street that the griffin was heading towards the mansion. Turning completely, Selena discovered with horror that the griffin was standing right in front of the window of her room, and decided that now it was definitely the end for her. Griffins cannot tell the difference between animals, magical beasts, and humans, but they have keen eyesight and smell. And the red color that is now smeared all over the girl's mouth is their favorite, as it symbolizes blood. Taking just one step forward, the beast found itself inside the room, shattering the glass. But suddenly, a great idea came into the girl's little head, which could promise salvation if everything worked out. She quickly headed towards her pile of fruit supplies, where she remembered exactly the blueberries were. The blue color means they are not yet ripe, and if mixed with leaves, a smell will emerge that the griffins hate and are weakened by it for a time. Holding berries and leaves in her hands, she looked at the beast, and the griffin looked at her. Realizing that she couldn't wait any longer, Selena began to crush and rub the berries and leaves between her palms with all her childish strength. And the appearance of the desired smell was not long in coming. As expected, the predator didn't like the smell at all, causing him to wince. However, the griffin had no intention of flying away from the hateful smell. but on the contrary began to approach its source. And now his open-clawed paw was ready to grab the child's head. Realizing that death was inevitable, Selena closed her eyes, preparing to die again. But suddenly, someone's strong blow blew the doors of the room open. Saying that the griffin was the most useless waste of his time, Edward appeared in the room, throwing his spear at the beast. It all ended instantly. The predator was defeated by an even more dangerous and powerful predator. Selena first looked at the dead griffin, then moved her gaze a little further, where her crushed food lay on the floor, which she spent so long collecting, which made her furious. Edward folded his arms across his chest, noticing the child sitting not far from the griffin he had defeated. After looking for a moment at the baby, who was lamenting the spoiled food, the man told her that she was like a cockroach. This treatment deeply offended Selena, and her hands even began to shake nervously at the thought of how he dared to address her like that. The baby and the man stared at each other with piercing gazes, one filled with anger and the other with contempt. The silence was broken by the voice of the Duke, who finally reached the room. A shout from his father, who was interested in the fate of the griffin, made Edward look away and turn around. But at that moment, Dorian saw a child sitting on the floor and asked what this little girl was doing here. And Selena sat and thought about where else she could be, except in her room. The overall picture looked rather strange. 2 grown men and a small child next to a griffin that had been struck by a spear. Looking at the men, the girl silently wondered why they were still standing there, when the danger had passed and the child could once again be abandoned to his fate. When his father asked him why the room looked so awful, Edward, crossing his arms haughtily over his chest, suggested that it might be because the commoner Margaret had once lived there, which made the Duke literally clutch his head at his son's arrogant antics. Meanwhile, Selena, no longer paying attention to the men, approached her crushed fruits and berries, trying to choose what to eat. Seeing this, the Duke flew into a rage, shouting that no matter what, this child had Bennett blood in her and the girl must be treated accordingly. Turning to the butler, the Duke ordered all the maids to be brought here immediately. Edward interjected, saying that there was no need to be angry with the maids for not keeping an eye on the half-blood, to which Dorian said that Edward had better keep quiet, since William was his son. And in front of them on the floor was Edward's brother's daughter, collecting some scraps. Such words could not go unnoticed by a little girl with the mind of a grown woman. After his father's words, Edward squinted and looked at the child, after which he suddenly said strange words that time moves forward. Everything changes. And the father changes too, becoming softer every day. Then the man, introducing his garden, told the child that he knew that she had been stealing his berries. Edward came closer and extended his hand towards the baby, assuming that the man would now grab her to deal with her, the half-breed, once and for all. Selena decided not to wait. With dexterous and quick movements, rolls, somersaults, she ran away from the hands that, as she thought, would now destroy her. Pleased with herself, she cast a victorious glance at the surprised man. But Edward, for some reason, didn't even think about catching up with her. Instead, he looked at the girl and suddenly asked her father what her name was. The question caught Dorian off guard, because he didn't know the name of his own granddaughter. Listening to this dialogue, Selena thought that overall it was good that the previous owner of this body could not hear the conversation of these cruel men, but she really needed some kind of new name. Just at that moment, Parsons returned to the room, bringing all the maids. The Duke cast a menacing glance at them and asked which of them was responsible for looking after this child. Meanwhile, the girl decided to leave this room, where too many people had already gathered, and crawled up to the maids standing in the passage, looking out for where she could squeeze through. Having received no answer from the maids, the Duke asked the butler whether the child had been assigned a permanent maid. Parsons replied that there was one nanny, but she suddenly quit in the middle of the workday. Selena noticed that the butler spoke very calmly and was not at all nervous when communicating with the gentleman, which indicated his long service to this house. And Adrian continued to look at the child crawling around the room. This did not please Selena at all, as she was only thinking about running away from here, and could not understand why the Duke's son was staring at her like that. The Duke himself, pointing to the scraps of fruit and berries lying behind him, asked if any of the servants knew how a small child had managed to get all of this. Bowing their heads and adopting submissive poses, the maids, as one, quietly said that they did not know the answer to the Duke's question. Then, Dorian asked another question about when any of the servants had ever taken an interest in the life of this child. and visited the girl in this room, while the maids took turns answering that one had been here a month ago, another 2 months ago, a third 3 weeks ago, and so on. Selena thought about what exactly had made them not lie, but tell the truth. These answers left the Duke amazed and truly furious, unable to believe that no one had even fed a child who had just learned to crawl for more than 2 weeks. He screamed furiously that the maids were crazy to do such a thing, but all they could do was lament that they had sinned and admitted their guilt in everything. The girl, in turn, noted that the Duke himself didn't really think about his granddaughter's well-being, given the current situation. In addition, Selena suddenly felt how hungry she was, without having had time to eat anything. And then the Duke turned his attention to the butler, declaring that he was in charge of the servants here, and should pay closer attention to how the maids worked, while slapping him in the face. Parsons accepted the gentleman's anger with dignity, saying that yes, he was also to blame for what had happened. Turning to everyone, Dorian again asked what the child had been doing for the past 2 weeks. Selena mentally answered his question, saying that she hadn't even noticed this time, surviving and getting food for herself. A sensible thought came to her as suddenly as always. While everyone is gathered in one room and deciding who is to blame for the fact that the child was abandoned to starvation, she can run out into the garden and finally have a bite to eat. And the treasured door that opened the way to food was not locked. With thoughts of freedom and food, Selena headed towards the exit. Someone's strong hand interrupted her forward movement, pulling her back and up. It was Edward who finally caught the child and turned with the girl in his hand to her father, who was now asking the servants how and where the child had managed to find food. His son answered this question, explaining that the girl had been stealing berries and fruits from his garden. This statement once again provoked a strong reaction from the Duke, after which he asked how old this child was. Hearing the number 11 months, the Duke thought seriously and could not believe that a child of that age was so smart as to get out of the room on his own and get food for himself. The Duke's son fixed his gaze on the child in his hand. But tired of the constantly twitching girl, Edward put her back on the floor, calling her a dirty creature. Having gained her freedom, Selena moved forward with the thought that she would have to take revenge on the man for his words and actions. But before she had crawled even a couple of meters, she saw another hand in a white glove reaching out to her. It was the Duke himself who tried to lift the child, which he failed to do, since Selena did not wait to be caught again, and crawled away. Looking at the angry baby, Dorian noted out loud that she was quite smart for her age. He then turned to the butler, saying that it was unacceptable to leave the child to live in such conditions, and instructed him to assign the girl a new room and new maids. Parsons approached the child with open arms and told her to come to him. Calculating Selena thought that if she could establish a relationship with the butler, she could always count on good food. After which she looked at Edward and came to the conclusion that he was not planning to kill her yet. And so, having weighed all the pros and cons, she finally made up her mind and allowed the butler to take her in his arms. The Duke was surprised that the girl, who had just run away from literally everyone, so easily allowed herself to be picked up by the butler. Trying to shout at the Duke to complain about him staring at her, Selena, who could not control her speech, shouted out the word "Dad." The Duke did not hear, or pretended not to hear, what the child had said, asking the child a question about what she had just said. The butler answered instead of the girl and confirmed that she had said the word "Dad." Embarrassed by what she had said, Selena tried to shout something, and this time she managed to shout a whole phrase, in which someone present was addressed as a fool. Edward was quick to point out sarcastically that he, of course, didn't know what his father had heard, but he thought the child had shouted out some kind of curse word. But judging by the expression on Dorian's face, his son's sarcasm didn't really please him. Without answering his son's words, the Duke turned to the butler and asked if he by any chance knew the girl's name. Parsons replied that if he was not mistaken, the girl's name was Cheryl, and Selena, being in the butler's arms, felt all the fatigue of the day that had fallen upon her. A moment later, she was already asleep, dropping her favorite pacifier on the floor. The Duke stood and silently looked at the sleeping child, who had suffered much over the past 2 weeks. Edward, who instilled fear in everyone, paid no less attention to the girl, where the sight of a small sleeping child brought back memories of his own son, Danny, at the same age. The Duke, who had already softened considerably, agreed with his son's conclusions. And Edward, who valued intelligence and quick wit in people, suddenly approached the child and, touching the girl on the head, said that this child had a bright mind, since she was able to wander around the mansion unattended and not die of hunger. Taking her small hand, he noted the presence of calluses and many wounds on it, apparently from rose thorns. The thought occurred to the man that the girl's cleverness was simply a coincidence. Deciding that his son was up to something bad, Dorian called out to him. But Edward had no intention of doing anything bad, saying that he was also to blame for the current circumstances, since he had done nothing either, and asked his father not to raise his voice at him unnecessarily. And then his gaze turned to the side where the maids, gathered by the butler, continued to stand. He gave them a foreboding look and said loudly that they had allowed a child named Bennett to starve and live without proper supervision, which was absolutely unacceptable. He then turned his attention to Parsons, saying that if he didn't want any trouble, he should keep a closer eye on the maids, to which the butler responded with a submissive bow. Having finished threatening the servants, Edward turned to his father, saying that he would now go to Danny, who had been crying constantly lately, and try to calm him down a little. The Duke gave instructions to the butler. In addition to preparing a new room and appointing a new nurse, it was also necessary to invite a doctor to examine the child. The request to call a doctor somehow surprised the butler, but the Duke confirmed that Parsons had heard everything correctly. The girl needed to be examined by a doctor. Then Dorian looked again at his little granddaughter, who was sleeping peacefully. And he also left the half-ruined room, where the griffin, defeated by his son, continued to lie on the floor. A new summer day had arrived, and the birds were chirping merrily in the garden outside the windows of the huge mansion. Selina finally woke up with a loud yawn. When she got up, she saw some new woman who joyfully announced that little Miss had finally woken up. Unable to find his pacifier, the child, out of habit of holding something in his mouth, used his own finger instead of a pacifier. And then a pacifier appeared in the woman's hands, which was accompanied by the assumption that the child was probably looking for it. In a matter of seconds, the pacifier was already in the baby's mouth. Selina guessed that she must have missed her pacifier when she fell fast asleep. And then she remembered her past life, where the powerful sorceress Selina never slept at all. After trying to shout out her own name, Selina noted that her pronunciation seemed to have improved noticeably. However, what the woman heard clearly left her completely confused. And a second later, she was already wiping tears from her face, saying that she was not the girl's mother. Looking at the crying woman, Selina could not understand what had suddenly happened to her, not realizing that she had shouted out the word mom instead of her name. But then the girl turned her attention from the woman to the furnishings in the room, where she noted that it was very clean and beautiful, and her bed seemed to be even larger than the previous one. The only thing she couldn't understand now was why she still had the old pacifier. While she was examining it, having taken it out of her mouth, the woman, as if understanding the girl's thoughts, said that she would, of course, buy her a new pacifier. But, bursting into tears again, she added that no more money was being allocated for the girl, and that the crying of this woman was already beginning to greatly irritate Selina. Suddenly, the woman asked the child to scream more often if anything happened, because if it was too quiet, she might think that something had happened. The next strange gesture was that the woman suddenly decided to introduce herself to the child, saying that her name was Sabrina, and Selina sat there with a corresponding expression on her face, thinking that she was not at all interested in anything that was voiced by this strange woman, where she could simply say that she would not buy a pacifier because she did not have money. The girl immediately remembered that in her past life she had a lot of jewelry, but there was an agreement that in the event of her death, all the jewelry should be donated to the fund of the Society of Magicians. However, as a precaution, she had the good sense to hide some jewels and magical stones around the world. The question now is how to get to your hiding places. Deciding that she needed to get this maid to go outside with her, where she could figure out how to get to the hiding places, Selina stood up and got her attention by shouting the word, "Market." The woman was very surprised that a child who was only 12 months old wanted to go to the market. Selina was ready to go crazy because of this misunderstanding and the stupidity of the woman, who for some reason was surprised that the child needed to go to the market. But then the maid said that she could take her to the market if the girl were not forbidden to leave the mansion. Hearing this, Selina immediately came to the conclusion that it was the tyrant Edward who gave the order forbidding her from leaving the mansion as revenge for the fact that she ate berries and fruits from his garden. And the woman continued, declaring that it was not a new thing to say that puppies are trained from birth, and from that moment on, she would begin training the child. What she heard made Selena literally sit up and look at the strange woman in bewilderment. She saw that there was clearly something wrong with the maid's eyes and facial expressions in general. In a past life, an experienced and powerful witch, Selena knew that practicing black magic required feeding on negative emotions, which is why she interacted with many disgusting people and senses them immediately. And this maid was radiating negative energy. Realizing that her salvation meant attracting the attention of strangers, Selena began to scream at the top of her lungs. However, the evil woman, calling the girl to be quiet, immediately shut her mouth with a pacifier. Selena felt that the pacifier was now somehow too tightly pressed against her head. It turned out that the chain installed on the pacifier was not to prevent the pacifier from getting lost or dirty by falling on the floor if it suddenly fell out of the mouth, but to secure it tightly to the head. The girl noted with horror that now she could not take out the pacifier. And if the situation repeats itself where everyone abandons her and doesn't bring her food, then she will definitely die. And the clearly abnormal woman continued, saying that today they would learn silence, and the child would turn out to be an adorable puppy. The maid, clearly pleased with herself, declared at the end that she was the best in her business. Deciding not to wait for further developments, and with the thought that the maid did not even understand who she was dealing with, Selena began to concentrate. The appearance of bright rays around the child confused the woman, where after their appearance, the child suddenly rose into the air, which left the crazy woman completely delighted, where she happily concluded that it was so great that her puppy could fly. Selena's thoughts were about how to somehow get to the garden, and if the maid follows her, Edward will catch her in the garden, and then her days here are numbered. The girl headed towards the exit with all her might, and the maid, with her strange expression on her face, which did not bode well, followed the child. Suddenly, the thought occurred to Selena that this maid was also part of Edward's revenge for the fact that she had been the boss in his garden. She crawled as fast as she could, but the abnormal maid was getting closer. Her voice, saying that the puppy was misbehaving and would be punished, was literally behind Selena. At that moment, right in the direction of their movement, the girl saw a man's silhouette. Edward Bennett himself was moving towards them. She had nothing left to lose, and she rushed forward, leaving Edward behind as well. The treasured door to freedom was very close, and Selena hoped that she could slip through without being caught. But then someone interrupted her movement, grabbing her by the collar of her clothes, where the girl prayed that it was not the abnormal maid. Her expectations were met because Edward caught her. At the same time, the owner of the mansion, Duke Dorian, appeared here and was greeted by his son. Meanwhile, Edward took the girl in his arms, as caring parents take a child. While examining the child, he carefully ran his finger along the chain on the girl's head. The Duke asked what was going on here. Ignoring his father's question, Edward continued to stare at the child, which made Selena feel increasingly uneasy. The maid, who had remained silent until then, finally spoke up, expressing surprise that all the gentlemen had gathered there. Now turning to the maid, Dorian asked why this child was here. Apologizing for what happened, the maid explained that she had only turned away for a second, which was enough for the restless child to run away. Such a brazen lie greatly angered Selena, who at the same time did not understand why Edward continued to hold her in his arms. Here the tyrant also put in his word, declaring that he remembered very well that he had ordered this servant to take good care of the girl, addressing the woman with the title of Baroness Sabrina Stone. Sabrina bowed her head in confirmation of what was said, and Selena was very surprised that she had a whole baroness as her nurse. Then the baroness began to claim that she was taking more than excellent care of the girl, that she was constantly watching her, and that this would never happen again. Seeing the look of the crazy woman and hearing the tone in which these words were spoken to her, Selena noted to herself that now she would completely pin her to the bed. Since the issue was no longer simply one of life and death, but one of personal pride, Selena decided to curse the baroness with black magic, which would require a large amount of mana. Everyone knows that white magic comes from nature, where the greater its source, the greater its power. But in order to use this magic, you need to train for a long time. But black magic was invented by people, where its source is their own evil intentions and grievances, thanks to which, even without outstanding abilities, one can become a very powerful wizard. Selena concluded that now she was just a child who wielded magic, but there was always a price to pay for using magic, both white and black, and she had no idea what she would have to pay for in this situation. Of course, the risk was great, because this small body might not be able to withstand the use of black magic. In the end, the girl decided to limit herself to the curse for now, and then deal with everything else. The child's thoughts were interrupted by Edward's words, stating that he found the child very curious. Looking up at the man, Selina couldn't understand why this tyrant was smiling like that. And the Duke's son was already reaching his hand towards the child's head, thinking out loud about what could be going on in this girl's little head. Slowly, he touched the chain on the child's head again. And at that very moment, the links of the chain broke as if by magic. For now, not understanding what was happening, Baroness Stone simply silently watched Edward's actions, who had already managed to remove the pacifier from the child's mouth. After which he suddenly turned his attention to the Baroness, declaring that if the devil exists, then he is now standing before him in the guise of Sabrina. Throwing down the pacifier, he asked the Baroness who was to blame for the current situation. The pacifier made a corresponding sound and fell to the floor. And only now did Selina notice this, her eyes wide in surprise. She had already become very accustomed to her pacifier, and therefore did not make everyone wait long for her reaction to the fact that it was taken away from her. At this point, the Duke intervened, saying that the child apparently needed a pacifier. He came closer, bent down, and picked up the pacifier from the floor, immediately returning it to the girl's mouth, who was not at all against the pacifier being in her mouth again, despite the fact that it had just been on the floor. The Duke looked in amazement at the child, who made some feelings awaken in him. Selina was only thinking about why everyone was looking at her like that. It seemed that with each passing second, Dorian was looking more and more intently at the child. But his thoughts were not about the child now, but about the fact that there was a chain attached to the pacifier. Selina was tired of this kind of attention and decided to ignore it by closing her eyes. Meanwhile, the Baroness decided to remind everyone of herself, saying that she did not quite understand what Edward meant when he spoke about who was to blame for what happened. At this, the Duke's son gave her a look that sent a chill down Sabrina's spine. Pointing to the chain, he asked the woman to explain what it was. The Baroness replied without a twinge of conscience that it was a device for educational purposes. Edward then asked her to clarify what exactly these educational goals were. This reaction of the man was surprising for Selina, where she concluded that it was clearly not he who forced the Baroness to mock her. Sabrina explained that the child was very naughty and misbehaved, and therefore, before it was too late, she tried to teach the girl discipline in this way. The brazen lie infuriated Selina, and she took out the pacifier and began to scream hysterically, trying to shout that she wanted to finish off this liar. She continued to scream and try to tell them to let her go, so that she could deal with the Baroness properly. Looking at this abnormal woman, Selina deeply regretted that she could not kill her right now, and Edward watched in amazement at the child's violent reaction to the woman's words. He understood that this child, who was so smart beyond his years, could not just have such a reaction. Selina was upset to the point of tears that she was now so helpless, and that all events were not developing the way she wanted. Suddenly, the Duke's son dropped to one knee and placed the child on the floor. Without thinking twice, Selina quickly headed towards where the woman was standing, thinking about how she could take revenge on her right now, shouting for this vile creature in the form of a child not to come near her. The Baroness raised her hand, apparently intending to hit the child, but at that very moment, Edward said menacingly that she would be in trouble if she tried to move even an inch now, and their family name would never again appear in the lists of the imperial aristocracy. These words had their effect and left Sabrina stunned, causing her to freeze and slowly lower her hand. And Edward continued to drill the woman with his cold-blooded gaze. Seeking protection from the head of the family, Baroness Stone expressed dissatisfaction towards the Duke, saying that such threats from his son were unacceptable. But the Duke was not merciful to her either, saying that she had crossed all boundaries. The behavior of the Bennet family members today continued to surprise Selina, who had no idea that they could so zealously protect a half-breed, and she herself was already interested in what would happen next. The heated Baroness suddenly declared that the Bennet family constantly gives their family only dirty and low positions, to which Edward replied that it was up to him to decide what was dirty and low and what was not. And Selina thought that now Sabrina was dealing with a real predator in the person of the Duke's son. Now let Baroness Stone feel like a victim. Approaching the Baroness, Edward declared that he hated two-faced and stupid people. He gave her the order to return to his estate, to lock all the windows and doors, and to draw the curtains. it wouldn't hurt either, so that from today on, no one would hear anything more about the Stone family. This order made the Baroness's legs give way, and she sat down right on the floor. With difficulty gathering her strength, the woman asked how long such an order would be given, to which Edward replied that until the Bennet family disappears from the face of the earth, any other family might be a challenge. But the Bennet family was so powerful that it was rumored that the Emperor himself bowed before them. Moreover, their family was never known for its kindness, where people who crossed their path disappeared forever. Edward immediately added that, of course, the Baroness might not listen to him. He was not forcing her to do anything at all. But the Baroness knew that what was said was an order hidden behind advice, and so she quietly obeyed. Turning to one of the maids, the Duke's son told her to take the Baroness home. Sitting on the floor, Selina noted that Edward was being very cruel now. But what the Duke's son did does not at all change the fact that she has her own revenge planned. To cast the curse, she needs to find straw, 12 rose thorns, and the Baroness's hair, where she decided that her hair would most likely be found in the room. The man's voice made the child flinch and distract him from his thoughts. It was the Duke who approached her and asked what the child was doing. He took the girl in his arms and began to examine her wounded hands. Selina remembered that in her past life she had very weak skin and was constantly getting injured. However, she decided that the presence of wounds was not a reason to feel sorry for her, and began to scream, thereby making it clear that she wanted to go back to the floor. Trying to calm the girl down, the Duke shook her up and down, which made her feel very dizzy. She calmed down, trying to contain her nausea, and the Duke remarked that he was good at calming children. Then he, swearing by their family name, said that he would not allow the child to suffer anymore and would assign his best servants to look after her. The stern old man that Selina once knew suddenly disappeared somewhere, and his voice sounded very caring. Now she began to feel that she was very tired of the lady who was assigned to her, and her eyelids began to grow heavy again, closing her eyes. The gentle rocking of the Duke's hands and his whispers did their job, and very soon his granddaughter was already asleep. He ordered the butler to find one of the maids who had experience raising children and assign her to his granddaughter. Edward just stood there the whole time, and surprised his father greatly by not even making a sarcastic remark. The Duke asked him about this uncharacteristic behavior, to which Edward said that he had decided that everything should take its course. It was unusual that his son had no objections. But of course, this state of affairs pleased the old Duke. Another day was in full swing. There was a man in a white coat and glasses in the room. He leaned over the cradle where the Duke's granddaughter slept and listened to the rhythm of her heartbeat. Dorian, standing behind him, asked the doctor how his granddaughter was doing. Having finished his examination, the doctor turned to the Duke, maintaining silence. The frightened man hurried the doctor to tell him everything as it was about his granddaughter's health condition. And the doctor said that the girl was developing more slowly than her peers, and it was clear that she had been poorly nourished. Meanwhile, the girl was sleeping and didn't hear that they were all talking about her. The Duke and Edward stood and listened in silence to the doctor's report on the child's examination. The man then stated that despite everything that had happened, the girl, surprisingly, was completely healthy, which caused the Duke to breathe a sigh of relief. The doctor then expressed his surprise that the child had been able to find food for herself on her own for 2 weeks. But this was not the main thought that now occupied his mind. What impressed him more was that now 2 members of the Bennet family were standing in front of him, worried about the health of their illegitimate child. This was surprising because there had been numerous instances throughout history where this family had cast out those who did not fit their standards. The baby was the daughter of the Count's son, so his visit was at least somehow explainable, but the doctor did not understand what his son Edward was doing there. Officially, Dorian Bennet has 3 children, the eldest of which is his daughter, Emma. His second child was his eldest son, Edward, and the third was the youngest son, Edward. This trinity of direct heirs did not get along with each other at all, and were constantly in competition. The doctor continued that all symptoms of exhaustion would disappear if the child ate normally. The man also noted that the girl had many injuries from crawling on concrete, rocks, and other surfaces, where now every movement for her must be very painful. And if the family cannot ensure that the child does not crawl on hard surfaces, it is necessary to teach the child to walk as quickly as possible. But then the head of the family stopped the doctor's speech, saying that it was no longer his concern. In a commanding tone that made the medic bow his head, the Duke ordered that the doctor should visit the child regularly. monitoring her growth and health. Night had come, and the outlines of the mansion were illuminated by the moon peeking out from behind the clouds every now and then. Rays of moonlight fell into the new room of the Duke's granddaughter, dimly illuminating it. The occupant of this room herself did not even think of wasting the night on sleep. Selina was busy creating the cursed doll, to which she had already added the hair of Baroness Stone that she had found on the floor. The job was done, which couldn't help but please the witch, since it took her a whole week, where she had to wait for long hours for the new maid assigned to her to leave the room. To have the opportunity to leave the room and start collecting the necessary materials to create the cursed doll. Crawling became less painful for her now, because knee pads made of stiffer fabric were sewn onto her clothes. The new maid also made a necklace for the pacifier instead of a chain that locked the baby's mouth. And now there was no need to worry about losing the pacifier or getting it dirty by dropping it on the floor. Looking at the doll, Selina noted that, of course, it was made a little sloppily, but it would be suitable for a curse, where all that was left was to drop some of her blood into it, supply the doll with magical energy, and then burn it. Clutching the cursed doll in her hands, the girl concentrated with all her might, calling upon her magical powers and beginning to imbue the doll with her magical energy. Gradually, the image before her eyes began to blur more and more, and now the little child, inside of whom lived an experienced witch, was already asleep. The moonlight that fell through the window of the Duke's granddaughter's room had long since been replaced by the rays of the sun. The chirping of birds outside the window woke up the little witch, but before she could open her eyes, she found herself in the arms of her new servant. But the woman did not keep the child in her arms for long, and as soon as she took the girl out of the crib, she immediately lowered her to the floor, giving her freedom of movement. Selina, who had not yet fully woken up, tried to figure out and remember what was so important she had done yesterday. Help with memories came unexpectedly from a maid who, showing the child a doll made of straw, asked with a smile where it came from. Selina stretched her hands up, making it clear to the maid that she wanted the doll returned to her immediately. But the kind girl, hiding the scary doll behind her palms, suggested that the child sew her a teddy bear instead of a doll. Of course, such a proposal was completely unacceptable for the witch who had spent so much time and effort creating this damned doll, and she had no choice but to throw a tantrum, which immediately yielded results, as the girl returned the child's toy with a good-natured smile. After which, with the most caring and kind look, Mary, that was the name of the maid, told the girl not to cry. Speaking the kindest and most affectionate words, the maid carefully lifted the girl, clutching the hellish doll in her hands, into her arms. And at that moment, Selina felt that she felt very strange when this kind girl took her in her arms. She recalled that in her past life, she had never felt as much human warmth as she felt during this short time spent with Mary. Selina came to the conclusion that perhaps this was the reason why the maid's touch seemed so unusual to her. She was very pleased with this new feeling, even though it was completely unusual for her. Mary noted out loud that the girl had a very scary face when she demanded the doll be returned, which was probably a consequence of the loneliness of a child who became attached to the doll. The embittered sorceress Selina was surprised that in such a short period of time this simple girl understood so much about her. Where Mary considered the Duke's granddaughter a delightfully sweet creature. Continuing to surprise Selina, the maid invited her to go outside and take a walk. It was a great idea that made the child happy, because it's always nice to walk in the sun. A luxurious table was set right outside, at which members of the Bennett family sat. One of them was Danny, who asked the child what she was doing. And Dorian, sitting at the same table, noted to himself that it was rather strange that the child still couldn't speak. Hearing her shortcomings discussed once again, Selina grimaced with displeasure. Then she noticed the tea set on the table and remembered that in a past life she had ordered the same one for herself, but had not managed to receive it. And now she was very interested in who had received it instead of her. Dorian tried to call his granddaughter into his arms. Looking at this invitation, Selina understood that she would not be able to always avoid being picked on. And therefore, the cursed doll that was with her had to be hidden, which she did, turning in the opposite direction from the inviting person, which greatly surprised him. Selina clutched the doll and thought that Dorian had seen a lot in his life and would immediately understand what this was, deciding that the child was abnormal. Or even worse, he might think that the girl stole the doll from Edward, which would cast the shadow of a black magic practitioner on him. While she was crawling and thinking about all this, the Duke called her to him again, calling her by name, Cheryl. Realizing that there was no time at all, she quickly shoved the damn doll into the bushes. And a couple of seconds later, she found herself in the arms of Duke Bennett's grandson, who had approached her, deciding that this would free her from the need to be in the arms of the Duke himself. Selena didn't really want to feel helpless in his arms anymore. She understood perfectly well that Dorian would simply pass her by if she were reborn as some commoner. And in general, witches never really got along well with knights like this Duke. Selena and the Duke's thoughts were interrupted by Danny's exclamation, who happily asked if Cheryl was his little sister. The Duke found no answer to such an unexpected question and remained meaningfully silent. Selena glanced at Dorian, indicating that she definitely knew the answer to the boy's question. And then the boy looked at the girl and asked why she was so nervous. Considering the question clearly not to be smart, Selena mentally answered it by saying that anyone would be nervous if they knew that a cursed doll was hidden a couple of meters away, which still needed to be retrieved somehow. And so the long-awaited night arrived for Selena. She was unable to get the doll from the bushes during the day, so she went to get it late at night. She really liked the new knee pads, which made her less likely to hurt herself, and generally made her crawling feel much better. Now she has learned to open doors with her magic without much effort and from any position. And so, quite quickly, she reached the garden, where she had been during the day in the company of members of the Bennett family, and took back her cursed doll. She had already returned to the mansion and was looking for a place to burn the doll to complete the curse when a voice called out to her, calling her by the name of Salil. Turning around, Selena saw a sleepy Danny standing in front of her, hugging a pillow. He sat down on the floor next to the child, and his eyes seemed very sad and tired to Selena. She suddenly felt very sorry for this boy, whom she had so often seen crying. She crawled closer, rose on her little legs and stroked his hair, which greatly surprised her son Edward. Not knowing how to react, the boy looked at the small child who seemed to understand his feelings. And to Selena, he suddenly seemed like a small, frightened dog that needed to be protected and petted. And suddenly Danny said that he missed his mother very much and started crying again. And the little girl looked at him with her understanding gaze, but did not know how and in what way she could help him. She simply closed her eyes and continued petting the boy. At some point, the Duke's grandson raised his head and suddenly asked the child if she missed her mother. Thinking that this couldn't possibly be the case, since she didn't remember her parents, Selena, having decided that the boy had calmed down, decided to continue her search for a place where she could burn the doll. Only now did she notice that she was standing on her own feet and had already taken a couple of steps away from Danny. She walked on step by step, deciding that practice would help her master normal walking faster, where she wouldn't have to put in so much effort to keep her balance. And the boy watched her silently. And then he started asking what the child was doing here and what she was looking for. Of course, Selena answered that she was looking for a fireplace, although this answer was only in her thoughts, and the boy only heard the word boo from her lips. Putting the pacifier back into her mouth, which she had been taking out while trying to answer the boy's question, Selena, and in her new life, Cheryl, continued on her way. But the boy again began asking questions about where she was going, which finally began to irritate the child. And suddenly he suggested that the girl go to the fireplace to warm up. The little witch did not expect such a turn of events, and silently allowed herself to be taken by the hand and led to where there was fire. Their path led along one of the darkest and most terrifying corridors of the mansion. The boy was clearly very scared and spoke about the danger of this place, to which Selena responded with her usual facial expressions, believing that if something happened, she, of course, had a better chance of survival. Suddenly, she felt the boy's hands shaking violently from fear. She turned around, once again looking into the face of this small, frightened boy. And the more she looked at him, the more she noticed the differences from his father, Edward Bennett. Not so much in appearance as in character. On the other hand, this was quite understandable, because he was cold only with others, but very soft with his family. But suddenly, Selena clenched her little fist, thinking that she shouldn't fall for this character, because even the closest people in her past life had betrayed her. And no matter how friendly the Bennetts are now, because they only behave this way because of their direct heir, Danny, they cannot be trusted. The boy's voice that they were there distracted Selena from her dark thoughts about loyalty and betrayal. She turned her head and saw in front of her a fireplace with a flame burning in it, which, as she immediately noticed, was made from a magic pipe, which the tower's magicians had been looking for quite a long time. Having taken out the cursed doll, Selena headed towards the fire, One swift movement sent the cursed doll into the very heart of the blazing fire. A moment later, the doll flashed and disappeared, activating the curse embedded within it. Continuing to stand by the fire for some time, Selena noted that she felt somehow strange about what she had done. Exhaling, she came to the conclusion that it was time to go back before the maid accidentally entered the room and noticed her absence. And again, Danny's voice made her wince as he said that nothing could be thrown into the fire. They had already left the room where the fireplace was located and were moving along one of the long corridors of the mansion. Suddenly, the boy stopped and said that he was a bit scared to sleep alone and invited Cheryl to sleep in his room that day. Selena was categorically not happy with the prospect of spending the night with this crying boy, which she demonstrated with head movements. The boy turned around and, without hiding his fear, looked into the gloomy corridor behind him, the end of which was not visible. Ignoring the child's refusal to go with him, Danny concluded that Cheryl agreed and, happily picking her up, headed to his room. Soon they were already inside his room. Selena was very surprised by what she saw in the boy's room. The floors here were covered with soft carpet, unlike her room. And in general, the room was more spacious and much more luxuriously furnished. She bitterly concluded that, compared to this room, her room was just some kind of den. The boy had already managed to approach the bed and was calling Salil to lie down with him. Suddenly, Selena caught herself thinking that this boy was very cute and would grow up to be a handsome man. She also noted that in some ways he would resemble Christopher, immediately noting that she still remembered that name. Suddenly, she felt herself lifted into the air, which was accompanied by the boy's words that it was time to go to bed, and that her brother would sing her a lullaby. Selena noted with a smile on her face that the baby was acting very arrogantly, calling himself her brother. While she was thinking about this, Danny had already managed to carry her to the bed, and before she could even wake up, she found herself lying under a blanket with a boy lying next to her. Danny said that they needed to keep the fact that he was her brother a secret, and Selena was thinking about how his bed was softer than hers. Wishing good night to his new little sister were his last words for the day, because in her company, he fell asleep quite quickly. Selena initially lay there thinking that he could think and say whatever he wanted, but as soon as he fell asleep, she would definitely run away. But then her eyes slowly began to close too, and within minutes, both children were sleeping peacefully, cuddled up to each other. Dawn came, and with the new day, new events began. The silence of the office where Edward was working was broken by the report of a man who entered inside. The Duke's son did not hear or could not believe what he heard, and therefore asked for what was said to be repeated. The man who entered repeated that Baron Stone had arrived, and he escorted him to the third guest room. The third room in the Bennet family was used for entertaining those of little value, and was furnished in a suitably shabby manner to show the attitude of the owners towards such guests. Propping his chin on his hand, Edward concluded with a sneer that the Stones had completely lost their minds. He then asked the man about the purpose of the Baron's visit, to which he replied that Baron Stone's wife had died the previous night. This news did not greatly upset Edward Bennet, as he despised this woman, but he voiced his lack of understanding of what had happened, because he had not sent anyone to kill the Baroness. The speaker added that according to information received, the charred body of Sabrina Stone was found in one of the rooms, but at the same time the rest of the interior was not damaged. Nothing burned, there was not even smoke. And in conclusion, the man said that the Baron now suspects the Duke of this death. Edward thought that such suspicions on the part of the Stone family were now fully justified, since the Baroness had experienced his wrath last week. Moving along the corridor, the Duke's son continued to clarify the circumstances of what had happened, asking that if it was not a fire, then who set the Baron's wife on fire? To which the man following the gentleman said that no traces of arson or flammable materials were found at the scene of death. After these words, Edward froze in place, because he, being an experienced and powerful wizard, realized that someone had set black magic into action.